Good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to you all for joining us after a very interesting Med Forum so far. We hope to have a very good debate after lunch to wake you all up from all that pasta. My name is Ellie Geranmayeh. I'm the Deputy Head of the Middle East and North Africa Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and we're delighted to be another partner to the Med Forum this year. We have a very extensive focus on the Middle East region, including Iran, which we've heard about a lot during this conference. And I'm delighted now to bring together experts and officials from inside Tehran to give us their perspective on how they see the regional security picture and wider issues. We've talked a lot in some of the sessions that I've been to, at least, about Iran's role in neighboring countries, also the nuclear agreement, and also domestic dynamics inside Iran in the aftermath of recent protests. So I'm delighted to have a very distinguished panel with us. Very quickly, so you can put name to faces. We have Dr. Sajjadpour from Tehran, Deputy Foreign Minister and the President of IPIS. We then have Vali Nasr, Professor at Johns Hopkins. We then have Aniseh, who's based at RUSI in London, Ellie Vaez from ICG, based in Washington, and Sanam Vakil, based with Chatham House in London. So we have a good breadth of expertise. I want to try and get a debate going on our panel as well, and I want to try and come to you in the audience for your reflections and questions throughout the sessions. So the format is going to be, we're going to have some brief opening comments by Dr. Sajjadpour. We're then going to have an in-conversation style discussion between us, and then I'm going to come to the audience for what I hope will be interesting, short, concise comments and thought-provoking questions. Let me turn to you, Dr. Sajjadpour. As you've been in different sessions, I've seen you ask questions. Lots of questions, I'm sure, for you today, particularly regarding this session, the focus of this session, which is Iran's role in de-escalation with its regional neighbors to bring about a heightened sense of security. So over to you for your thoughts to begin.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's a pleasure to be here today with you in this panel, and I thank all my friends and colleagues and ambassadors who are here. Though I was introduced as the Deputy Foreign Minister, which I am, but I don't have any hair, but I have two hats. I use the academic hat because, the official hat, you should be very precise and very meticulous in your wording. Usually I say it by jokes, and I have used some jokes here. What's the difference between an ambassador, a general, and a think tanker? I'm not going to use the previous years. I have been here for many years, a new one. And the reason that I use this joke in order to say what I say is my own. And the joke is, what's the difference between these three species? All over the world, generals start very early in the morning. They don't do anything real, but they start very early in the morning, all over the world. And diplomats don't do anything real. Sorry for the ambassadors here. But they end very late in the evening. They have to go to receptions. And as think tankers, never early morning, never late in that night. The conferences should be on time, but they never can live without conceptual frameworks. So with that frame, I try to have a conceptual framework of Iran and the Persian Gulf, Iran and the region. And the question is how to understand the development and what is the solution. I think I have ABCs, but A first, C next, and then B. I think on A, I have an analytical frame that I have to discuss. I think the problematic with the region is mostly analytical. There are misperceptions, misrepresentations, reductionist approach, selective approaches on understanding the region. But to be more precise, there are asymmetries in the region, which are very structural. Iran has the northern shore of the Persian Gulf. population-wise. So there is asymmetrical structural relationship, and this should be taken into account. But we also see binaries in the analysis which are not right. Iran versus the Arabs. Actually, we see more Arabs conflicts in the Persian Gulf during the last two years than Iranian ones. What happened to Qatar? You saw the foreign minister of Qatar mentioned last night. I think furthermore, we have a cognitive problematic in the region in the analytical frame. That is a zero-sum game mentality, that either we are and the others are not. I think this is the base of the Saudi mentality today. Not all the Persian Gulf Arab countries. This is very important. A type of addiction to external forces, addiction to Iranian threat. If tomorrow Iran says, and I have no threat, no, still this addiction is there. This is the reason that some of these countries became very happy because Trump came. They invested a lot. And they went for turning Iranian-US relationship to a militarized relationship. 4 months ago, 5 months ago, the possibility of this was a reality, and here I go to the context. So with this mindset, you have the context. How is the context? Accumulated reasons for conflict, busy actors, finally, the possibility of conflict is there. And I think it's real. And it was real. But when it was becoming more reality because of Iranian resolve to defend its interests, Trump withdrew from, let's say, its very tough mentality vis-a-vis its allies. There was a calculus change in the region on some part of the players there. But what's important is which is my final point. Here, where is Iran? Iran has a frame, which I call it building frame. 3 components in this frame. This is my own conceptualization. First, assumptions. We have this assumption that we can work with our neighbors. We feel self-confident to work. And nothing is strange about being in this neighborhood. There is nothing wrong in that structure. You can be asymmetrical in terms of power, but still manage it. We don't need external forces to fix this relationship. This addiction should be ended. And my B is the significance of bilaterals. We value bilaterals. You see our bilateral with Oman is working well. With Qatar is working well. With Kuwait, it is good. So why don't we work on bilaterals? Then my C is a cooperative regional plan, and that is reflected in our president's plan offered in the General Assembly. That is hope, that is Hormuz peace endeavor. What are the premises of this, along with the assumptions and bilaterals that I mentioned? That is very simple. Non-intervention, non-aggression, dialogue among the regional players, using United Nations Resolution 598, Operative Paragraph number 8, which asks the Secretary General to organize a regional security dialogue. So I think these are the elements. We think we can do it. There is no need for making the situation conflict. We have to accept each other. Accept Iran. Iran is there for 40 years. You cannot change it. Regime change is an impossibility due to a lot of force. Don't be excited by some of events in the region. There are structural realities that you have to accept. And I think the common interest should be the base. Very simple. So we are for de-escalation. We are for cooperation. And I think our cooperation is genuine. We appreciate the role of Kuwait for bringing the letters that President Rouhani wrote to the head of state to their attention, and still we remain hopeful for the hope. And I think to end, what we need first is an analytical frame in which cognitive map is very important. B, this is the building of a very cooperative situation, and C, the context is conflictual. Let's turn it, the dynamism from conflict to cooperation. Is it possible? Why not? Yes, it is possible. It has worked with other nations. In that region, it can work with the others who think we may not be able to solve the issue. External forces during the last 5 centuries have not been helpful in that region. Spain, Portugal fought in the Persian Gulf. Netherlands was there. British Empire still has. I think the Americans have done nothing for the security of the region. As I said in today morning in one of comments, now US is the most confused player, but we need clarity, and the clarity is we need to live together peacefully, and it can only happen by cooperation. We are ready, but please revisit the assumptions and don't emotionalize the frames that can be helpful. So I stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sajjadpour. Let me ask you a follow-up question. You mentioned the role of Kuwait in passing President Rouhani's letter to GCC members as well as Iraq, which are members of this HOPE initiative that Iran has launched. Is there anything you can share with this group regarding the initial responses that Iran has received either directly or via third parties towards this initiative so far?
I think the initial response differs from one to the other, but the fact that there has not been any rejection by itself is positive. And
a second follow-up. Yesterday, we heard from Saudi Arabia's foreign minister that they actually welcome greater US participation in the region, and that Saudi Arabia views the security architecture that the US has provided as essential for its own regional positioning. How does one marry this position of Saudi Arabia with Iran's position that this has to be an exclusively regional-owned process?
I think Saudi Arabian foreign minister needs to be looked from the angle that I said. They are addicted to a protection from outside. And has it worked? I don't know. We understand them. I mean, we appreciate the interest of any individual states in the Persian Gulf. But you have to look at, during the last 40 years, this addiction to Iranian threat. You know, he had a type of cliché of what we hear. But look, who supported Iraq in its war against Iran? In Persian, we say it was not my aunt. You know. It was Saudi Arabia plus the other GCC member states who did so. So why? Because they think Iran is a threat. Why a threat? Where have we invaded? During the last 2 centuries, you can see Iran never attacked, invaded. And during the last 40 years, it may be astonishing for you, Iran has been always on defense. Even when you see the Iranian pronouncements may seem assertive, it is purely defensive. Because look, what have we done that we have been too sanctioned? We negotiated for 3 years, signed JCPOA. It became a United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231. Then suddenly this gentleman came and said, I withdraw. Then Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel supported this withdrawal. And he supported sanctions against Iran. What does sanction mean? Sanction means depriving Iranians from food, from medicine, from daily life. Is it neighborhood? I think why they do so, because they are addicted to the threat of Iran, and there is vested interest in taking Iran as a threat always, which negates the realities on the scene.
So we've heard a lot about the threat perceptions on both sides. Sanam, let me come to you. You've been traveling a lot in the GCC as of late. You had a great report out recently looking at how regional players view the endgame with Iran. How does one marry the position of the Gulf actors in the GCC with that from Iran at the moment? What is your view on this?
Thank you, Ellie. I think it's a good perspective to reflect on. And without going and reviewing the history on both sides, I think that having just returned from Riyadh and also from Abu Dhabi, I should say that a number of factors are very much driving some shifts and contradictions within the Gulf. Obviously, we all remember the activity over the summer, the attacks on tankers, the downing of the drone. All of this has provoked widespread anxiety throughout the GCC, anxiety about the commitment of the United States to the Gulf countries. And despite the arrival of American troops to the Gulf, there is widespread anxiety that is very real about the long-term US commitment as a security guarantor in the region. And that must be taken into consideration when trying to analyze and understand the Gulf position. We know, of course, that the Gulf countries very much supported maximum pressure and see Iran, larger perhaps than it is, and see Iran as a threat, a country that, while it hasn't directly attacked or invaded another country, has indeed supported, nurtured, and created militias that operate against the interest of other Arab states around the region. So from their perspective, again, maximum pressure seemed at the time as a viable way of constraining Iran's influence. What we're seeing, though, now, after the summer, and particularly since the September 14th attacks on Saudi oil facilities, a sort of shift in position. The UAE, over the summer, has quietly pursued its own path of de-escalation vis-a-vis Iran, and has done so for its own purposes. The economic climate in the Gulf, of course, has suffered from this instability, and to protect its economic interests, its open for business position in the GCC, the UAE has pursued an independent path. That again has been bilateral. We've seen movements between Abu Dhabi and Tehran over the past few months that suggest there has been a dialogue and a sort of cooling of tensions on that side. In Riyadh, however, despite the passing of messages from Imran Khan and potentially also from Putin, I don't see a shift away from maximum pressure. I think actually Riyadh doesn't see any interest in de-escalating with Iran. Really because, and this is very much reflected in a new study we have just published at Chatham House that does take into account the Arab Gulf position, there hasn't been any deep thinking how to de-escalate with Iran. Riyadh very much supports the 12 demands pursued by the Trump administration, and Riyadh also would like to see Iran change its behavior, but it hasn't really articulated what it would bring to the table in any dialogue. So I think that is a challenge. And instead what Riyadh is doing is trying to dial down tensions within the GCC. We have seen engagement with the Qataris that is building momentum, and the GCC summit next week is expected to yield some efforts at rapprochement. Of course, it's not going to resolve the past 2.5 years of tensions in any means or brush them aside, but it will be an important step forward in promoting GCC unity. And as a second pathway, Riyadh is also looking to find a resolution to the Yemen war that has been going on far longer than was anticipated. And I think that by leading the path to resolution in Yemen, the kingdom would like to push Iran out of that dialogue and make Iran irrelevant to that resolution, so that Iran cannot use the issue of Yemen as its own carrot or its own incentive for engagement, either with Washington or with the region.
Thank you, Sanam. So if indeed the direction of these actors is to make Iran become irrelevant, that poses, I think, quite a problematic trajectory in terms of what the Iranian response will be. So Ali, let me come to you now. We've seen a lot of events of turbulence inside Iraq in particular, in terms of pushback regarding Iran's positioning in the country, coupled with obviously the domestic issues at play. Things aren't looking great for Iran either in Lebanon. So with this whole picture in mind, and domestically the pressure cooker is also on high alert, what do you think what are the possible range of responses that Iran is likely to have in the coming months ahead on the regional platform?
Thank you, Ellie. Let me start by saying it's a pleasure to be at MED, and also it's a particular honor to be on this panel with three wonderfully smart and knowledgeable Iranian women, and I want to congratulate ISPI for this wonderfully gender-balanced panel. It's a rarity in Washington, I have to say. You know, to answer your question, I actually can build on what Sanam just said, which is, I think one of the reasons that Riyadh has now taken a step back from incipient process that seemed like there is de-escalation, at least a rethinking and some planning for de-escalation with Iran, I think is the protests that we've seen in Iran, in Iraq, and in Lebanon. Now, my sense is that in Iran, and I stand to be corrected by Ambassador Sajjadpour, but my sense is in Iran, they're still processing what has happened exactly. And there are two main schools of thought. One is that obviously there are legitimate grievances in both of these countries. There is fury at domestic failures of governments in Iraq and in Lebanon. There is frustration with mismanagement and corruption. But there is also a strong Iranian threat to these protests. And that's where I think the Iranians start drawing conclusions that maybe this is fueled by the outsiders, Iran's rivals in the region and the United States. And there's some evidence for this that the Iranians point to. Obviously, statements coming from the Trump administration, suspiciously the release of leak of Iran's Ministry of Intelligence documents at a time that Iran's diplomatic facilities in Iraq were under attack. And so this, I think, creates two sort of different responses in Iran. One is to say, now is not the time for reform, because this is part and parcel of US maximum pressure strategy aimed at curbing Iran's influence in the region. So stability comes first, even if it's at the cost of repression, and reforms come later. There might be some recalibration, I think, on the Iranian side, because there is a recognition that maybe there were some excesses during the fight against ISIS. I was personally shocked when I was in Baghdad last year, seeing photos of Iranian officials in main squares. It was really in your face, the role that Iran was playing. Obviously, we all remember selfies of General Soleimani posted on social media. And I think there is recognition that maybe we have to take a step back and recalibrate Iran's role in the region. And you know, this reminds me of what Ryan Crocker used to say, that Iran is a self-limiting power. The harder they push, the more resistance they create for themselves, because it's a sui generis power. It's a Persian nation among Arabs, it's a Shia nation among Sunnis. And as such, there is a ceiling to how much influence it can have in the region. The other side of this coin, I think, is the fact that the coincidence of these protests in Iraq, Lebanon, and Iran, which I think is likely to strengthen the hand of those who don't want to show any flexibility and believe that reforms at this stage would basically further destabilize these governments. My fear is that this might result in the collapse of the political order in Iraq that has existed in the past few years, and the economic meltdown in Lebanon, which could also push the country into becoming more and more unstable.
Thank you very much, Ali. So we've touched on the position of the US policy on Iran and the maximum pressure campaign. Vali, let me come to you on this. Where do you think US policy on the region, particularly vis-a-vis Iran and the GCC, but also the wider Middle East, headed for the remainder of Trump's first term? And let me pair that with a second question, since this is something you've been thinking about. Where might we see shifts in a new US administration if we were to have one in 2021?
So thank you. Let me just quickly also touch on some of what was said. You know, Iran's relations with the Arab world has been problematic, largely, as Ali said, because of the nature of Iran and where it's located. And it will be problematic even if the Islamic Republic were not there. It was problematic when the Shah was there. It's problematic on the Islamic Republic. And as I said, it's going to be problematic going forward. And so you have to understand the tensions today in a context abroad. You could go back to the 16th century where battles were fought over Iraq, and there was a Cold War between Iran and Iraq throughout the 1970s. And the last time Iran actually took Arab territory was under the Shah, the 3 islands from UAE. So this is not necessarily something that was invented by the Islamic Republic. But in that context, a few things are important. One is there is an arms race in the Middle East. And both sides obviously are investing in an arms race in order to protect themselves. So Saudi Arabia, Israel, UAE, Bahrain are receiving advanced weapons from the United States. And Iran has invested in asymmetric warfare, as they call it, or militias, essentially, as its weapon systems. It's gone down a very different path. And you might say nuclear missiles, et cetera, have to be understood in this context. And I would say, actually, if the Arabs think the nuclear deal made things worse, it's largely because the United States tried to compensate for the nuclear deal by selling over $100 billion worth of weapons to the Arabs. So that, in a way, the Iranians then said, okay, we gave up the nuclear program, but the real winner essentially is Arab countries who got a winfield of weaponry, and so they doubled down on the missile program and other advanced technologies. So this is not going to be solved unless there is a sort of an arms control approach to the region. So everybody has to freeze. The United States has to freeze selling in exchange for the Iranians also freezing their activities. Otherwise, in the current zero-sum scenario in the region, this would continue. The second is that for decades, there was successful containment of Iran. It wasn't called this. It was called the Carter Doctrine, dual containment. This is systematically has collapsed. First, thanks to the US invasion of Iraq, which took a huge building block of this containment wall around Iran. Then the Arab world itself has collapsed under the weight of the Arab Spring. And right now, everybody may cheer Lebanon and Iraq, but if Lebanon and Iraq melt, it would only further weaken the Arab world before it actually has an impact on Iran. And as a consequence, the Arab world is not able to be the partner to the United States to contain Iran, and President Trump has made it very clear that he's not willing to carry through containment either. If you believe that Iranians are hitting tankers, shooting down drones, and hitting oil facilities, and you're not doing anything about it, means that you're not really going to be enforcing containment in the region. And how many troops you put there, you can put the numbers in Wall Street Journal. It doesn't mean anything unless those troops are going to be used at some point to enforce containment. And I think that's also part of the picture. On Yemen, I would say, I found some of the comments of the Saudi foreign minister yesterday disingenuous, because Saudi Arabia continuously argued that the Houthis were 100% Iranian clients. Shias converted to Shiism. This is an Iranian manufactured crisis. And largely, it's difficult to imagine that Houthis would go to the table without Iranian blessings, and that Iran has not done anything to sabotage either the Omani or the British peace efforts there. So I think in some ways, the Saudis may wish to extricate Iran from Yemen, but they're not going to get to an end game in Yemen unless Iran sort of decides not to play the spoiler. Now, the US policy is, I think, problematic at this point for the Gulf countries. And one of the reasons that a number of them are also started talking to Iran is exactly this. Yesterday, Minister Jubeir said something which I think is the core of the Saudi policy. We want Iran to be isolated and remain under sanctions. In other words, don't go to war with them and don't make peace with them. Keep them exactly where they are. This is the Goldilocks sort of, if you would, position for Iran. And Trump now is pushing for the other two scenarios. Either they're going to go to war, which is now increasingly a worry, given that maximum pressure is bringing to power in Iran the most hardened, if you would, militaristic side of Iran that is perhaps willing to take risks and be adventurous. If they go to war, the Gulf will pay the price for that. The economy in UAE is going to tank further. I don't know how many missiles you need to shut down all the airports in the Gulf. I've heard this said that first day of a war, how many trillions of dollars are going to leave in terms of foreign investment from the region. And in fact, I would say the Aramco IPO makes actually Aramco much more vulnerable to instability in the region because it creates gyrations in the price of the shares. So it's either war or he's going to talk to Iran. And if he talks to Iran, it's not going to be any different than what Obama agreed with Iran. It's going to end up being about the nuclear deal, as he's mentioned in his letters to the Iranian leadership, as he mentioned it on the podium in Tokyo. And ultimately, how much is the JPCOA going to be different? Sunsets are going to be 5 years further out, 10 years further out. Iran will make a few more concessions, but Iran will get further concessions. The principle that the Gulf worried the Gulf when JPCOA was signed was that a crack opened in US-Iran relations. So, the minute, we saw the game that was played in New York of Trump trying to talk to President Rouhani. Imagine if that had happened. That would be back to the Obama years in some ways. So in a way, the pressure on the Gulf is largely that the United States is not the United States of old. And so there are two scenarios. Either President Trump would get elected, which potentially, we will see this game play out. Either he's going to end up going to war with Iran if things get out of hand, or he's going to end up having the meeting that he's been pushing for, and then that meeting will basically have follow-ons going forward. And that meeting will exclude the region. At the end of the day, these meetings tend to focus on narrowly on what can bring the two sides to the table. And unless Iran agrees to bring the region, the US cannot force Iran to accept them to the region at the table. Or that the Democrats would come back in. And then that's a bit complicated. The different Democrats are saying different things. Some are saying they want to go back to JPCOA. Some are saying that we're too close to the sunsets and other clauses and we have to renegotiate. But by and large, probably the Democrats will be moving away, if you were to say, from where Trump is. But let's not forget, there is now incredible bad blood between Gulf countries and the United States over the treatment that the Obama administration got, the Khashoggi issue in US Congress, and the Yemen war, which has now become a significant issue in Congress. So it's not going to be just sort of a snapback to where we were before.
Indeed. Thank you, Vali. So we've talked about the role of the US. Another relatively, I would say, important player in this game at the moment is Europe. We're seeing some initiatives being put forward, particularly by President Macron of France. There is talk, murmurs of this special vehicle for trade known as INSTEX processing the first transaction before the end of the year as a safeguard to keep the nuclear deal in place, which hangs by a balance. Aniseh, let me come to you. What role do you see for European players in this Iran-US, Iran-GCC dynamic, given the special relationship that some of the European capitals have on the ground?
Thank you, Ellie. And I just wanted also to thank very much ISPI and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for organizing this very topical discussion today. Yes, Europe is in a very tricky situation at the moment, one in which it didn't want to be. And I think it really would want to play a significant role, but it doesn't really have the leverage and importance that it wish it could have. And I think, of course, we can differentiate of different issues and different files, but I think overall, what Europe is in a challenging position for is not the fact that it has a different position with the US. That has been the case already in the past, especially on Iran. I mean, Vali was talking about dual containment. Already in the 1990s, Europe had a very, very different posture towards Iran. And instead of isolation, pressure, and sanction, was actually promoting and deploying diplomacy and engagement with Iran. That has been the strategy that Europe has adopted towards Iran all the way, especially on the nuclear issue since 2003. And this is the strategy that Europe would like and is still like to promoting towards Iran, both on the regional issue but also on the nuclear file. At the same time, as you say, there is this special relationship. So it's very difficult for Europe to maintain that kind of engagement with Iran without having to take into consideration the fact that it's not just having a divergent view with the US, but it also has to face off the attempts by the US policy to undermine what are perceived as the European policies. I'm talking particularly about the nuclear issue, but also on the regional file. We have seen yesterday, for instance, the Foreign Ministry of Saudi Arabia talking about the reasons, not talking about the reasons for maximum pressures to be basically adopted by Europe and not being able to justify why that was the case. I think this is indicative of the fact that there is still a lack of clarity or acceptance by the US and by its allies in the region of the fact that Europe is not really in line with the US and is not really keen to adopt what is called the maximum pressure campaign. At the same time, however, adopting an independent line is very difficult because of the power that the US has with regard to the economy, but also because of the regional confrontation we have seen over the past few months. So I think from a European perspective, what it can really do, it's very limited with regard to the policy options, but I think it's very much in line with what it did already in the past, which is continued engagement and a shuttle diplomacy between Iran and the United States. The difference with what happened before is that I think the goal from the European side is to understand what it would take for both sides to come to the negotiating table and to save face with some sort of a negotiation, a deal. You talk about the Macron initiative as well, the main vehicle of discussion, but there are also broader discussions about what it would take for both sides to come to the negotiating table and have some sort of rapprochement. The problem, differently from the past, is that while the Iranian position is very clear to the Europeans, the American position is not. There is a different confusion compared to the past to what it would take for the Americans to come to the negotiating table. And that, I think, is unprecedented. I think from the European perspective, there is an assessment that, yes, pressure might have been useful in the past, but that was very much adopted in correlation with engagement. So there was the dual track policy that was adopted between 2006 and 2010 and all the way until the nuclear deal was adopted. And I think this is very much a policy that Europe would still like to enforce at the moment if had to come to some sort of engagement with Iran. And I think from the European perspective, there is a lot of frustration with the fact that the United States is not coming to terms with the fact that together with this maximum pressure campaign, there has to be some acceptance of the fact that you need to give some incentives of something in return for Iran to come to the negotiating table. And from that point of view, the Europeans have been struggling over the past few months. And despite the fact that this Macron initiative has very much the backing of all the European capitals, especially the major one, the E3, there has been a challenge from the European front to have the buy-in of the Trump administration. And I think that is where really the difficulty from the European front is. Without the buy-in from the US, we are likely to face a stalemate with regard to any kind of moves, with regard to a rapprochement or some sort of engagement between Iran and the United States. Whereas from the Iranian side, I know that it might sound weird, but I think there has been some sort of coherence with regard to what it would take for Iran to engage with the United States, and that has been clear all the way since May 2018 with regard to the desire by Iran to maintain the oil sales and to have continuation of the trade access to some sort of financial mechanism you mentioned. That's obviously we can talk about that and the failure of that mechanism, but also the attempts by the Europeans to have that kind of a mechanism to enforce some sort of trade relation with Iran. But I think at the moment there is more frustration from the European side on what is the lack of clarity from the US side compared to what is the lack of clarity from the Iranian side.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask each of you one round of questions with quick, sharp answers, and then we'll go to the audience. So please start preparing your questions. So Aniseh talked about this stalemate that the Macron initiative has found itself in. There is a glimmer of hope, perhaps, that a quid pro quo between DC and Tehran is possible. This morning there was news that there has indeed been a detainee swap between the two sides, facilitated by the Swiss. And Foreign Minister Zarif was in Switzerland, which perhaps explains why he wasn't at the Med Forum to implement this. Ali, let me ask you, is this something that shows that this sort of a breakthrough is possible if we can find that magical win-win formula for both sides to have a safe facing way out? What should Paris take away from this example?
Hard to give you a very short answer, but I'll try. Well, it is an incipient but important step. This is the first time in 3 years that Iran and the Trump administration have managed to agree on anything. So in and of itself, it's an important step. But I think it's a mistake to overestimate its potential. It's also a mistake to underestimate its promise. I think the difficulty in the Macron package that Aniseh was referring to is that it is very ambitious. The Iranians have put the minimum bar for the price of the ticket that President Trump wants to buy, which is a meeting with his Iranian counterpart, removal of all the US sanctions, not just the ones that have been snapped back since May 2018, but the ones that the Trump administration imposed when it came to office. So they want to go back to January 2017. That, I think, was difficult in September because there will be a backlash in Washington. It is more difficult now after the crackdown on the protests in Iran, after the president has been significantly weakened because of the impeachment. And I think it will be more difficult with time because Iran has its own elections, parliamentary elections in February. Then the period between February and November is also quite difficult because the US would be in full campaign mode. And probably President Trump would be also more risk averse in dealing with Iran, which by definition will be controversial in Washington. And so I think the best way of resolving this is to lower the bar and maybe do a phase one of the Macron plan. So instead of going to January 2017, maybe go to January 2019. When the US was still out of the deal, sanctions were still in place, but Iran was selling 1 million barrels of oil per day. And in return, Iran could stop its nuclear escalation because probably the next step that they would take in January would be enrichment to 20% level. And the Europeans who are already at the end of the rope, I think, will be forced to start the dispute resolution mechanism of the JCPOA. And then that would, if it results in the snapback of the UN sanctions, the Iranians have already said that will be a red line for them. It will push them not just out of the JCPOA, but out of the NPT altogether. So this crisis will deepen in a situation that we have so much turmoil and friction in the region. In the past 6 months, we've come twice to the brink of military confrontation between the two countries. So this is not a sustainable situation, even for 11 months.
Yes. Vali, you had a quick two finger to this?
Just to add to what Ali said, I mean, it was actually President Trump who raised the January 2017, I'll lift all the sanctions if I get the meeting price on the table. And then the issue, particularly in New York, became one of sequencing. Iran wanted first proof that he was going to lift the sanctions, And he wanted first a meeting, and then everything would follow from that, and that didn't work. I think actually what Ali's talking about is really an issue of not thinking about a bigger deal, but actually really thinking about ceasefire. You know, those whole things right now, in the sense that Iran won't take additional steps vis-a-vis JCPOA, maybe can go back on one or two of them, and the US maybe is not lifting all of the sanctions, but would allow Iran exemptions for a period of time until they meet. The problem is, as Aniseh was saying, is the lack of clarity in Washington, because the president wants the meeting. Yeah. Right? He doesn't want lower level diplomats agreeing on a ceasefire. That was eminently doable. It could have been done in Biarritz. Right there and then, the Iranian foreign minister flew in. Yeah. They could have made that agreement. So I mean, I think that the problem is actually the fact that the president wants the meeting but doesn't want to make a commitment to a process.
Thank you. Dr. Sajjadpour, President Rouhani, even last week, has talked about his government's openness towards diplomacy, even with the United States, if the right conditions are there. A question that I had yesterday to our colleagues from the US was, if Iran is looking at how the United States is negotiating with its adversaries, such as China, the Taliban, North Korea, it doesn't have a lot to work with in terms of diplomacy paying off. Now, with the events of this morning, it's a small but a very concrete example that a quid pro quo is possible. Do you think that there is hope inside Tehran that there can be a diplomatic way out within the remaining term of Rouhani's government?
I think the space is there, but it is not bilateral. As it has been clearly our position, bilateral diplomatic interactions at this juncture with the setting that you have is not practical possible. But there is a base, that is JCPOA, which is a multilateral space. And I think yesterday we had JCPOA Commission in Vienna. This commission is enshrined in the letter of JCPOA, and that creates a space where all members can attend at different levels. Yesterday it was at Deputy Foreign Minister level. So I think within multilateral, it is possible if US reconsiders its policies and especially sanction. And you know, this sanction is not just an easy issue, because for us, we don't call it sanction, it is economic warfare. And as was referred to by my friend, I think when you want to change the dynamism, you need at least a ceasefire. And I think the ceasefire is within this Macron plan, but that is also dependent upon. So to be short and put it tersely, in multilateral format related to JCPOA, I think still there is room and space.
Sanam, in addition to your two finger, if I were to put the Trump hat on you, well, not the Trump hat, let's put his advisors' hats on you. So folks like Secretary of State Pompeo, other members around the inner circle who are advising, they are the Iran whisperers. If you're seeing what's happening inside Tehran of recent weeks with the protests, with what international groups are calling a very brutal crackdown and repression, would you think that it's time for negotiations, or would you think it's time to dial up the maximum pressure campaign?
It's a good question, Ellie, and thank you for bringing it up. I think that in Washington, but also in the Gulf, looking at the protests inside Iran and the gravity of the Iranian reaction, it would be easy to say and take away from the protests that Iran is now weak, let's continue to double down. But I think that this is actually an opportunity for both sides to use the tragic outcome of these protests to come to the table. Washington is looking for a face-saving solution. They are both in the same room. I mean, Tehran and Washington are in the same room. They do want the same end game. The question is how to facilitate that. And what I see, maybe a slightly different approach than my colleagues, is to get there is through a back channel. We are seeing too much public diplomacy for anything to succeed right now. And in order to get President Trump and President Rouhani to that famous meeting, we actually need to have a bilateral, quiet, secret meeting, similar to what took place the last time we all went through this, to define the terms and parameters of what those negotiations are going to be, to build some trust, to have some confidence in both sides. And I think that if I was a Trump whisperer, I would be drawing from this initial prisoner swap to maybe continue and release a few more individuals from Tehran and on the American side, build confidence and start building that back channel that we shouldn't know about, that shouldn't be leaked, that is a completely secret operation.
And how would the Gulf actors, the GCC actors, feel about that?
Well, the Gulf, of course, is going to be insecure about it. They know it's coming, though. And what I've heard from Gulf interlocutors is that they know that the negotiations will inevitably happen, that they will be limited in scope, they will not be able to address the regional issues, and they can't expect to be in the same room, but if they're in the room next door,
that's good enough.
They could try and rally and protect their interests at the same time.
A quick two-finger rally.
It's interesting because, like everything else in Iran-US relations, I think the protests have created two diametrically different conclusions in Tehran and Washington. The Trump administration obviously sees it as evidence that maximum pressure is working. Iran is becoming unstable. But interestingly, in Tehran, I think there's a totally different conclusion because they say, look, we managed to contain this protest that was a nationwide explosion of frustrations, pent-up frustrations, in a matter of 3 days. And even there was, again, in their view, foreign intervention, and it didn't work. And so this has proven that the Iranian system is in full control at home. And obviously, the tensions during the summer demonstrated that it's powerful in the region as well. So these are all evidence that the maximum pressure is not working. And in that totally different conclusions, I think, lies the challenge in Iran-US relations and the prospects of diplomacy in the future.
My final question for now, Aniseh. Ali talked about the possibility that come January, or perhaps a few months after that, the E3 governments may indeed decide to trigger the dispute resolution mechanism under the nuclear agreement. Now, how likely are they to do that if there is some traction, positive traction, on the US-Iran dynamic, or is it irrespective of what's going on?
It's a very difficult question to answer. I think the component of the European policy on Iran have merged. They used to separate the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, from the regional issue. Obviously, that has been more and more complicated, especially since May, when Iran started to respond to the maximum pressure campaign on both files, on the nuclear issue and on the regional file, and therefore the European policies has also had to adapt that kind of situation. I think in the immediate, there is a lot of concern from the European side on what will come with the next announcement. So you were talking about the ticking clock between now and November. That clock is even more concerning from the European side, not between now and November, but between now and January, and then January 60 days after and 60 days after, because obviously the steps that Iran has taken over the past few months have been more and more concerning, and it will be difficult from a European front not to respond, while before that has been easier to justify in light of the fact not that the JCPOA has to be maintained for the sake of it, but because, first of all, there are genuine concerns from the European front that without the JCPOA, you won't have the kind of inspection, verification, IAEA access that you currently still have. And second of all, without the JCPOA, you don't have the kind of multilateral engagement that we were talking about before. You don't have that kind of channel. You don't have the same type of communication system that you would have with Iran. So it's difficult to isolate the JCPOA from the rest of the issues, but without that kind of JCPOA, the whole channel will collapse, and that would make it even more difficult to understand whether it's possible to arrive to a solution, to a back channel between the US and Iran, and to some sort of rapprochement on broader issues which entail the ballistic missiles or regional behavior in the region.
Thank you, Aniseh. Let me open up the discussions. I'm going to take 3 questions at a time. The lady here, and then if there can be a mic taken to Mark, who's in the corner. So if we have 2 mics, that would be great. If not, let's start with the lady here. And if you could keep your questions very short and to the point. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much to all the panelists. My name is Gaia Pellegrini. I'm an independent journalist. I have one question and one very brief comment. The question is, how do you see the upcoming elections in Iran in February playing out? And are they going to be significant or have a role and an impact at all? And the comment is just from a Lebanese perspective. I've lived there for almost 4 years. And I think that it is a common mistake of international viewing of what's happening there to read it in a Iran-Hezbollah perspective, because the people there are fed up with everyone. And while Gibran Bassil was sitting here yesterday, 3 people committed suicide because they can't pay their bills in Lebanon. So I think that to read it in that way, although obviously the dynamics starting from the HIFPA, which was implemented actually under Obama before Trump, was to hit Hezbollah, I think they need to be read in a separate dynamic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mark? Yes, correct. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Mark Katz, George Mason University and the Atlantic Council. Russian observers have been noting that, unlike the US, Russia can talk with both Iran and with the Gulf Arabs, and that there's a possibility that Moscow could lead to a mediation for the relationship. And I have to admit, as someone who studies Russia's policy toward the Gulf, I was kind of hurt that none of you talked about this possibility whatsoever. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about it. Does Russia, is a Russian diplomatic option feasible? And what would it take? And why hasn't it happened yet? Thank you.
And the gentleman just in the front row here.
Thank you. Heinz Gärtner, University of Vienna. Several of the speakers said both sides should come back to the negotiating table to somehow renegotiate the JCPOA. Except for face-saving reasons, I do not know what you can really renegotiate in the JCPOA. The JCPOA is the best arms control agreement in history with comprehensive verification measures, and it doesn't have an expiration clause. It's permanent because it's based on a resolution, as Dr. Sajjadpour mentioned, 2231, and the preamble says Iran never will achieve nuclear weapons, and that's international law. If you have include behavior, no arms control agreement in history includes behavior. We never would have any arms control agreement if you include behavior. And the missiles should be addressed on a regional level, so involving all the regional powers. So that's including confidence building measures. So that's.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question from the lady in the red just there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the panel, but I think there is one problem with this, that we are just talking about politics. I mean, we have to also think about, what we are talking about is the life of people. People are living the hard situation. My question is that I am from the generation that basically we believe in actions instead of words. I want to ask the young panelists, what can young people do, or even ordinary people do, in order to make the situation a bit better,
Inside Iran, you're asking?
Just in the region.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to separate the questions out so that we can have more rounds of questions.
So give the young one to me.
We have an easy escape there on that one. But Dr. Sajjadpour, let me start with you on the question of Russia. We did indeed not mention it, but I had it in my list of questions. We had a few panels yesterday where the Russian perspective was presented. We've also had this Russia white paper on security in the GCC and Iran, which has been doing the rounds. What is Tehran's take about the legitimate role that Russia can play in de-escalation?
I think the question had other dimensions about mediation of Russia, why we don't talk about mediation. First of all, you have to see that we had about maybe 24 suggestions for mediation, 22 or 24, and our answer to all of them has been positive, and Saudi's has been negative. So Russia has tried, but the question is the readiness of the other side. May I also correct my colleagues that it's not GCC versus Iran. First of all, where is GCC? I don't want to get to the details of GCC. We know their internal dynamics, but they are in difficult situation. You have problems with Iran and Saudi Arabia. I think Bahrain is a sovereign state, but is an extension of Saudi foreign policy. And then you have UAE with, of course, evolving changes toward Iran. So the issue of mediation is contingent upon the readiness of the parties. And I think Russia has been sincere in this regard in offering its help and, let's say, tools available to it. But furthermore, your question is much broader on Russia. I think Russia has a very clever policy in the region, having reach to everybody, every actor, and with Iran we are enjoying a very good relationship. I think never we had such a expanded relationship, both horizontally and vertically, with Russia. And I think on the Russian Persian Gulf project, we have been invited, actually our institute was invited to Moscow by Russian Institute of Oriental Studies. So we share the principles. There are some nuances, but I think the basics of that proposal and the fundamentals are approved by Iran. And I think Russian-Iranian cooperation is an added value for regional peace and security. As it was mentioned in the morning, what you see, and you also notice here, US is first of all for confrontation or confusion. So US policy today can be described by a confrontational mood with Iran, and I think some of its allies are for confrontation, of course to a certain point, but it's also very confused. On the contrary, Russian policy is for cooperation, bilaterally and multilaterally, and it's very clear. It's for cooperation. So you see, and Iran has a lot of Eurasian space available to itself. And that's very important, a strategic point. I hope we have time to discuss. I'm
going to actually pass other questions to other colleagues, but obviously also the role of Russian mediation is also being played out on the Syrian conflict as well.
And it's very successful. You see the Iranian-Russian-Turkish cooperation was really successful on political ground.
Let me take the geopolitical questions first. Ali and also Aniseh, can the JCPOA really be negotiated beyond cosmetic issues? Ali, quick 1 minute on that, and then I'll pass to Aniseh.
Look, I'm obviously biased towards the JCPOA, but and I think it's a good deal, but it's not a perfect deal. And I think one of the lessons drawn from what happened to the agreement is that you can't have a narrow transactional deal between Iran and the US that would survive the broader context of enmity between the two countries. And that's why I think 2016 was a wasted opportunity for the two countries to make progress on broader areas of disagreement. I agree that JCPOA in and of itself, you can only do marginal improvements to it. But I think we need down the road, not just the JCPOA 2.0, which has maybe some additional elements into it, as Vali said, maybe some longer timelines or fixing here and there with little improvements, but we need the JCPOA Plus, which basically adds other areas of disagreement so that the deal becomes more sustainable.
And you say, if the US and Iran are going to agree on this deal, are the Europeans going to just be left in the corner?
I think the Europeans had played and will continue to play still a significant role as mediator, as the partner that allows for these two countries to get together and negotiate. Otherwise, I see it as very difficult, as it was mentioned by the ambassador himself, to have bilateral negotiation, being on the nuclear issue or on the regional issue. So on the European side, that is the main contribution. But I wanted also to stress two things. One is the fact that even if there is discussions about JCPOA 2.0, Macron initiative on all of that, from a European point of view, the stress for now is to do whatever is in their power to make the JCPOA survive. I mean, they will tell you all along. So to bring Iran back to full compliance and to ensure the survival of the JCPOA. So they very much agree with what you said about the fact that this is a very good deal and it's worthy of remaining in place and addresses the major concern of European partners, and this is why they are investing so much capital in it. But I think what has been the lesson learned from this deal, one of the lessons learned, is that an agreement is not sufficient. You need a treaty. You need something for which you can say pacta sunt servanda, and then you can enforce an agreement beyond, as you say, different legislation, and without parties, choosing, depending on who is in power, to enforce it or not.
Although you can't necessarily trust treaties anymore either. Vali, you had a quick two-finger before we move on to that.
I mean, first of all, frivolously, if you looked at the US-Korea trade deal that was redone, treaty that took years to negotiate was done in a few weeks by changing a few paragraphs. And even the NAFTA plus is essentially the same deal with a few minor cosmetic changes. But I think the point Aniseh raised is very important, is that when you go to the table, in America, we constantly talk about what is it we want more from JPCOA. The question is, what will Iran ask when they come to table? I mean, there were things they forgot to ask first time, like guaranteed lifting of sanctions, varieties of things. And there's a reason why, aside from efficiency, why things like Hezbollah, missiles, etc., were not included the first time. Because sanctions attached to those are in the US Congress, and the administration did not want to go to Congress. That's why they didn't even call it, they went with the word, not even an agreement. They didn't call it an agreement, it's a plan. Essentially, they tried to avoid going to Congress. If you open up JPCOA, the next American president, Democrat, or if it's President Trump, has to be willing to deliver in Congress. And I'm not sure that they can, especially given the tenor of the relationship right now. So I think, in some ways, this is wishful thinking in America to say, even among Democrats, that, look, we should just not go back to JPCOA and ask the Iranians to give us some more things on it without considering what it is that they have to do and the fact that they have to deal with Congress.
Sanam, let me come to you to pair two questions, which is A, what can we expect in the upcoming parliamentary elections in February in Iran, particularly given the impact of the protests? And B, since you teach young students about leadership in this region, what can be expected of the younger generation in terms of shifting the dynamics away from the current confrontation?
Sure. On the elections, of course, even before the protests, I think that there were concerns in Tehran about the outcome of the elections, and two issues specifically. I think that there one expected outcome, of course, that could perhaps change because it's still early days and people are registering their candidacies right now, is that there could be lower degrees of turnout, a reflection of the disappointment from the failures of the JCPOA, the economic crisis in the country, and so people won't turn out to vote. There were early indications. I mean, just looking at the Tehran municipality elections last year, participation was very low, less than 10%, for example. Parliamentary turnout is generally lower than presidential turnout in Iran, but it's still much higher than what we see in many European countries, for example. So that is the space to watch, and how the candidates will try and mobilize on bread and butter issues. But the concern of turnout is definitely there. And then the concern of Guardian Council vetting is the second issue. Will there be perhaps a more lenient position in vetting candidates for this parliamentary election because of the protests? That could be something that government spokesmen have indicated already, that we could see a shift in position yet, but it's too early to tell. Nevertheless, the elections are going to be an important barometer of where the country is right now on those issues, and could suggest or foreshadow what to expect in the May 2021 elections. On young people, it's always a tough call to give advice to young people when I'm sitting in London and young people are sitting in the region and having a very different and much more difficult experience. So I'm quite careful in what advice I would give young people in the region. I wouldn't encourage people to put their lives at risk, but what I would say is be involved, be politically engaged, be politically active, join the discussion, and don't be afraid to press back. I think the power of the youth is probably the most important hope that I have about the future of the region. And I suppose one positive sign is that people want change. People are not happy with the status quo. People are tired with the elites everywhere, and not just in the Middle East. So perhaps it's time for a circulation of elite and to see young people get involved in politics and push back against the established status quo. It's time to see younger generational change in Iranian leadership. I'm calling for it. It's time. Where are those young people? I understand it's sort of a stagnant system, but get involved and try and change it. There's some young people I follow on Instagram and on Twitter, and I'm very impressed by the things that they're saying, and including some young female parliamentarians in Iran that are equally impressive.
Thank you very much.
Can I have a comment on the old and the young?
Very quickly.
I think the question was very good, actually. I was impressed by the young generation. But I think this is my very humble, I think I'm the oldest in the panel. I think what we see on the regional side, we need the younger generation energy to humanize the context. Because we see a lot of forces who try to demonize each other. Otherness is becoming the source of, securitization. Iranians, look at how they pronounce even. I think the issue of humanization of this very, very brutal context, which they try to construct, can be done by young, by their connectivity, by social media, that we are the same, people of the region are the same as anywhere else. Maybe I add also one more, as an older, I think now we have the globalization of anger everywhere. Everywhere. I mean, she's right that you see it's not just Middle East. And I think this globalization of emotions and anger doesn't limit to the young generation. It's a very overarching issue which requires a lot of analytical discussion. But I think anger management and turn it to a practical step. Yes, this is very important. You may be angry, but how you want really to change. It needs plan.
We'll carry on the CBT sessions after this. I'm going to take some more questions if people want to catch my eye. The gentleman there, and if we can actually pass the mic to the lady in the side, please.
Is it working?
Yes.
My question is to Mr. Sajjadpour. Actually, it's true that one of the main themes within the Iraqi protests is to end the Iranian presence. Is it true? I mean, it's not just constructed. But the thing is, I believe that Iran's presence in Iraq is rooted in Iraq's weakness and instability. If Iraq remains unstable, Iran will remain powerful, even in the post-protests. But my question is, very quickly, Iranian supported actors in the Middle East will remain powerful. But the question is, what approach of soft power, what type of soft power Iran needs to develop in order to get back the popular legitimacy, the popular support to these actors?
Thank you very much. And the lady at the front.
Hi, this is for Dr. Sajjadpour. It's Amy Kellogg from Fox News. It seems that there's a disconnect in the dialogue. You said today, and Iranian leadership is constantly saying that Iran is a peace-loving country, and Iran has never attacked another country in history. And the United States, at least, is not. Just a disconnect the message that Iran puts out is that we're a peace-loving country, we don't attack anyone, you don't need to worry about us, why are you so scared of us? The US is not buying that. The US's line is Iran needs to stop its malign activity in the region. So isn't it time for some further discussion about that issue? If Iran is accused of this time and again, rather than just saying it's a peace-loving country, shouldn't the message be to explain its activity in the region, whether you consider it malign or not, and why Iran is involved in Yemen or Lebanon or Syria, exactly, and try to justify what it's doing and explain possibly how it could change what it's doing if it feels it could or should.
Thank you. I'm going to use my chair's prerogative to open up a little bit more of the conversation. I'll come back to you, Dr. Sajjadpour, with those two questions at the end. But Vali, a question I had for you is, as someone who's been watching the social fabric inside Iran, how instrumental do you think the events, both domestically of recent weeks, but also the experience with the nuclear deal, will have for those voices inside the leadership that have been pushing for engagement and diplomacy versus confrontation to have more influence in the internal compromise bargaining that always happens with foreign policy decision making? How do you see that trajectory in the next few years ahead?
Well, at least what we've seen since 2016 is the moderates, those who are supporting engagement with the U.S., those who supported the JPCOA among Iran's leadership have systematically lost altitude. They've been under pressure. They've been accused of having been naive in trusting the United States, in actually giving up a major national asset and not getting anything for it, and have put Iran essentially in a hole without the leverage that it had. And it's very difficult for them to make a case as politicians that their political project actually was correct and that it has served Iran's national interest. Now, you could say the protests could make the argument that still Iran needs some kind of a deal, maybe the ceasefire we were talking about, maybe the Macron deal, in order to bring money into the Iranian economy in order to alleviate the problem. But the dilemma is that unless, as Sanam said, that the US sees this as an opportunity to say, okay, maybe Iran actually may be more willing, let's reach out and see whether there's a possibility of even a mini deal. Ultimately, I don't think the moderates have anything to play with other than, I think what President Rouhani said a few days ago was as forward-leaning as he could get, to say, I'm willing to meet within an hour if you're willing to lift sanctions. But there's nothing coming from the other side. And if they don't, I think, President Trump will end up finding out that by the time he gets to talk to Iranians, it's the wrong Iranians that he doesn't want to talk to them. I think it would be very wise of him to talk to former Deputy Secretary of State Bill Burns, who had an experience dealing with Saeed Jalili. Those of you who follow Iran know who he is. And he also dealt with Foreign Minister Zarif. Ask Bill Burns how different those experiences were. But I think on the other side, what I'm seeing is that the moderates in Iran are disappearing. They're either completely being sidelined or they are being radicalized. Their political position is untenable. I think I always say, President Trump managed to bring regime change to Iran. It was the wrong kind of regime change, which is disempowering the moderates in Iran.
Thank you. Sam, a question for you. So we've been talking about the fact that we may well get into a stalemate where the situation doesn't change. Iran seems to have had some sort of a positive feedback from the UAE to its regional outreach, not so much from Saudi Arabia. So if you're sitting in Tehran and the maximum pressure campaign is only dialing up, Saudi Arabia isn't being accommodating, and you feel like you need to lash out because the more hardline voices that Vali talked about are gaining ground, isn't it inevitable that something's going to go pop at some point in the coming months?
I think you've pretty much nailed it. We've discussed the diplomatic options. We haven't discussed the sort of kinetic military options that are also dangerous. We're in a fork in the road, and we're going to hope that the diplomacy takes hold, building on what we've seen, hopefully, just from this morning. But at the same time, Iran, I think, has demonstrated that it is under pressure. It's under pressure because it is taking up the tenor every 60 days. It's under pressure because it is engaged in escalation in the region. And of course, there was a lot of shock and awe and surprise at the effectiveness of that escalation and the humiliation from that escalation in Abqaib and Khurais. But it sort of suggests that it has to continue down that path in order, if the diplomatic path doesn't work, in order to facilitate another way to the negotiating table. And so there are two ways to get to President Trump. One is, of course, the diplomatic compromise that we're all struggling to see come to fruition. The other way is, of course, identifying some more targets, particularly in Saudi Arabia. Hopefully, the next escalation will be as elegantly executed and targeted so that there is no loss of life. But you know, this is where you get into unpredictable territory, and you just don't know who is going to react and how they will react. And perhaps the goal is to provoke reaction. You know, I think in my mind, maybe this is a October war scenario, go to war to get to peace. And maybe war is a little bit of an exaggeration, but kinetic reaction to get to the negotiating table. Because in absence of that, time is ticking, people are suffering, and when Iran is not going to get the attention it deserves, people are distracted, there are things happening, there are elections everywhere. So you've got to maybe create some noise in order to get to the solution and get to the negotiating end.
And talking of kinetic action, Ali, let me bring Israel into the picture. Because presumably Israel isn't going to be happy about any sort of a back channel happening between Iran and the US. It's taking a much more military posture, very evidently. The plausible deniability days are over now with Israel in terms of how it's hitting back Iran. Where do you think Israeli assessments are going, given also their own domestic troubles?
That adds to the concerns that Sanam was just talking about. Let me just say that in Iran, I think there is this view among some of the hardline elements that the only thing that poses an existential threat to the system is a land invasion that is just not on the cards. That means anything less than that will result in regime survival, and you know, as the Americans say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So the view is that the regime can absorb any kind of military confrontation with the US that by definition is going to be surgical and limited. Now, in Israel, I think the attack on Aramco was a game changer because the kind of capabilities that were used, this joint combination of swarming with drones and very low-flying cruise missiles, that, you know, the formidable Israeli anti-ballistic missile defense system has not just been, hasn't been built for that. It's built for missiles that come from the sky, not missiles that actually fly very close to the surface. And if you're sitting in Israel, you're thinking, maybe Hezbollah now has 10 of these. Should I wait another 10 years for it to have 10,000, or should I stop it now? And then add the political motivation to it, which, you know, with the prime minister being in so much trouble, maybe a conflict, a clash, could potentially help him distract attention, which, by the way, would also be the same incentive in Washington. The deeper President Trump is in troubles at home. So that's why I really think Sanam is so right in talking about the risks now, because we're really at the mercy of a single miscalculation that could put the entire region on fire.
Thank you. Aniseh, let me come to you. I mean, how concerned should Europeans be about this risk of miscalculation? Because right after the oil tanker attacks in May, we had a lot of foreign ministers coming out with statements for de-escalation. It seems like there's a lot of fatigue now in European capitals about concerted diplomacy around this issue. What's your take?
Yes, I think you're right. There is definitely fatigue, but I think it would be a mistake to say that the Europeans are not concerned. Obviously, as I mentioned before, the JCPOA is the main avenue in which they are trying to de-escalate tensions. First of all, because it's the main security concern, the nuclear issue, but it's also because they have more leverage, frankly. But at the same time, they have been basically clarifying their concern on other issues. We have had the attribution statement issued by the E3 capitals at the UNGA. We had, I think a couple of days ago, a letter issued by the E3 again to the UN about the possibility of Iranian missiles being capable of hosting nuclear warheads, and this will be discussed at the UN Security Council and on the 20th of December. So I think it would be wrong to just assume that the European capitals are not concerned or not trying to do anything. There is also this conversation about, I'm talking about a conversation, but it's a little bit more than that, about the European-led naval mission. And obviously that has been interesting to watch, both because it's kind of unprecedented, but also because it indicates some of the friction that you were referring to at the very beginning between European capitals, with the UK siding with the US-led mission by default, and the other capitals, again, led by Macron and France, trying to take a lead on that front. And I think the only reason why they are doing that is they're concerned about something popping up and leading to some sort of confrontation and intended escalation, but also the fact that, frankly, there are not many ways to see this issue being de-escalated besides having the diplomatic channel tried and with some sort of attempts to have the ISPI in some sort of negotiation with the US.
Thank you very much, Aniseh. Dr. Sajjadpour, let me marry the two questions that were posed to you, which is essentially about Iran's position in the power, its soft power projection, and the way it explains itself. There's a lot we could go into here, but is Iran doing a good enough job in explaining its position in the region and with the US?
I think the question was different, so you are diverting the question. The question of a peace-loving lady was different than what you suggested, because she talked about Iran as a peace-loving and the concept I have. I think what's important about this gentleman's question and her question is about understanding Iran. And here I have my ABCs again, but in a different order.
33 seconds.
B, blame game doesn't work. Don't blame Iranians for any wrongdoing here and there. A, analytical frames with one simple question: how to understand Iran, Iranian security needs, Iranian society. And C, communicate with the Iranians, and I don't mean just Americans, and I don't mean on the governmental level. When you come to Iran, you communicate with the Iranians. When you see Iranians, nice people like any Iranian that you see outside Iran, I think the picture differs from what you have in media. So I think more communication will tell you that Iran that is depicted is Iran different from the realities of Iran. And may I end by saying that acceptance of realities of Iran, accepting that it is a regional power, genuine regional power. It doesn't rely on any external forces. It's the only player in that region which is 100% produces its security domestically. It has a vibrant, dynamic, debating, really diverse society. So any simplification of such a country would result to wrong analysis and bad assumption. So talk with the Iranians more and don't read some of the think tanks which are paid to just depict Iran as a danger. We are peaceful and we remain peaceful, and we try to explain to the others, and gradually they will understand. Thank you.
Well, on that point, I actually would say would be, on the point of communication, if Iran is able to open its doors to more foreign media, particularly Fox News. I mean, Fox News gave President Rouhani a platform for an interview when he was at the UN. This was unprecedented for...
Fox News is something else. This lady is something. I know her from a long time ago.
But I still think if Iran wants the world to understand it better, it also needs to open itself also up for more exchanges. Let me thank all of the people on the panel and for your time. I am going to end on a hopeful note because it's very rare on Iran panels to do that. But I do think that all of the different tracks of mediation on Iran, whether it's the Swiss, the French, the Japanese, or the Omanis, should take lesson from the small breakthrough we had this morning, that I do think a win-win solution for both sides is possible if there is enough political will from both Iran, its regional neighbors, and the United States. So we hope that next year's panel comes with better news. Thank you very much.